On October 13, 2016, Antipope Francis spoke to a group comprised of Lutherans and people who claimed to be Catholic. In his speech, he uttered another astounding heresy. Francis condemned proselytism / trying to convert people again, as he so often does, and he was reported as saying, quote, "It's not right to convince someone of your faith. Proselytism is the strongest venom against the path of ecumenism," end quote. The news reports correctly captured the essence of what he said. A literal translation of his Italian words, however, shows that his statement was at least as horrible as reported and perhaps even worse. Francis literally said, quote, "It is not licit to convince them of your faith. Proselytism is the strongest venom against the ecumenical path," end quote. Wow.
Non è lecito convincere della tua fede. Il proselitismo è il veleno più forte contro il cammino ecumenico.
So, according to the notorious heretic Antipope Francis, trying to convince someone of your faith is illicit and it is venom. This is simply a condemnation of Jesus Christ and the Catholic faith. In the Great Commission recorded in Matthew 28 and Mark 16, Jesus tells the apostles to teach and make disciples of all nations, to convince all people of the gospel and true Christianity, and that those who don't believe will be condemned. Francis declares this to be illicit. In fact, it's very interesting that Francis made his statement in response to a girl who said that most locals don't belong to any, quote, Christian denomination. The girl was asking Francis how to convince people she knows of what she considers to be Christianity. Francis responds by telling her that to convince them of Christianity is illicit and it is venomous. He is literally preaching a new gospel. He is declaring the gospel commission to be illicit and wrong. Well, we know what Scripture tells us about those who preach a new gospel. Quote, "As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you have received, let him be anathema." Galatians 1:9. That's why it's essential to reject the apostate Francis as a non-Christian heretic and an antipope. Francis's new gospel condemns Jesus Christ, the apostles, the saints, the missionaries, what the Catholic Church has always taught, and many dogmas. It is total apostasy. In fact, in his meeting with Lutherans on October 13th, Francis also taught the notorious and condemned heresy that there are non-Catholic saints, a heresy he has taught many times. He was also presented with a statue of Martin Luther and a copy of the 95 Theses, which he willingly received, more actions which manifest his utter rejection of the Catholic faith. Pope Leo XIII said that you are not to be looked upon as holding the true Catholic faith if you do not teach that the faith of Rome is to be held. Francis, therefore, cannot be considered Catholic. He is a notorious heretic. The Catholic Church teaches that the offense of heresy automatically, by its very own nature, severs a man from the body of the Church. And since a heretic is, by definition, outside of the Church, he cannot be a valid pope or hold office in the Church. It's also interesting that in this statement, Francis equates trying to convince someone of your faith with the term proselytism. This further refutes those dishonest defenders of the Vatican II sect, such as the heretic Jimmy Akin, who desperately claim that when Francis repeatedly rejects proselytism, he is not rejecting attempts to convert non-Catholics, but only a particular kind of coercive approach. That's nonsense, of course. They are deceivers and liars. They are tools Satan uses to keep people in the Vatican II sect, the end times counterchurch. The word proselytism means to convert or attempt to convert someone. That's also how the Vatican II sect uses the term in many statements. In this October 13th statement, we see once again that Francis directly equates proselytism with convincing someone of the faith, and he rejects it. There are numerous other statements in which Francis explicitly rejects efforts to convert people and equates proselytism, which he rejects all the time, with those efforts. Now, when considering Francis and his notorious heresies, there are many people who are dismayed by what he is doing, but they don't get the point. They still accept him as the Pope. As a result of faithlessness, blindness, and having imbibed the false teaching of heretics, they fail to adopt the position that Catholic principles dictate in the face of Francis's notorious heresies. That's why it's very important to understand the following truth. According to Catholic teaching, only those who are baptized and profess the true faith can be considered members of the Catholic Church. Let me say that again. The Church teaches that if a man's external profession of faith is not the true faith but a false faith, he cannot be considered a member of the Church. People should immediately recognize what this means for Francis. Even though true Catholics know that Francis is a demonic heretic who is guilty of notorious heresy many times over, and that also proves that he's not the Pope, it's not necessary to employ that argument to prove that he's not the Pope. The fact that he's not the Pope is proven by simply an objective recognition of the reality that the religion he preaches in the external forum is not Catholicism, but a false religion. Since Francis professes a false faith and preaches a false gospel in the external forum, you cannot, according to Catholic teaching, consider him to be a member of the Catholic Church or a valid pope. To consider him to be the pope in the face of these facts is to equate a false religion, that is, his false profession of faith, with the true faith, because when you say that he's the pope, you are, by definition, declaring that he's a member of the Church who professes the true faith. That's why this is so serious. One must reject Francis as an antipope and a heretic who is outside the Catholic Church. The very integrity of one's profession of faith is at stake. The fact that he's outside the Church is also proven by the Church's teaching that those who dissent from Catholic teaching in even one point are to be considered outside Catholic communion and banished from the Church. Francis notoriously denies many dogmas. He even admits that his own teaching might be heresy and he doesn't care, a perfect example of pertinacity. Also, beware of certain false traditionalist deceivers, such as faithless and dishonest heretics who are promoted by the Society of St. Pius X, who make the following argument. They say that as long as a man claims to be Catholic and hasn't been declared a heretic, and considers the Church's magisterium to be his rule of faith, he is to be considered a Catholic and as one who professes the true faith, even if he teaches notorious heresy after notorious heresy for years, and the content of his positions on specific dogmatic issues is the opposite of the Catholic Church's teaching.
What the profession of the true faith means is that the person acknowledges the Church as the infallible rule of faith. That's the key. So to the extent that these popes have, and they have, acknowledged the Church as the infallible rule of faith, their materially heretical statements alone do not sever them from the body.
In other words, according to that argument, a man can profess notorious heresy and hold the opposite of the Catholic Church's dogmatic teaching on a specific issue or specific issues, and he still professes, quote, the true faith, as long as he says he's a Catholic, recites Catholic creeds, and claims that the Church is his rule of faith. That is diabolical nonsense and flat-out heresy. According to that heresy, to be a Catholic there's no requirement to actually profess or maintain consistency with what the Church specifically teaches on various issues, such as what the Council of Florence taught or what the Council of Trent taught or what Vatican I taught. No, according to them, to be Catholic it's sufficient to claim the name Catholic even if you teach or profess the opposite of Florence, Trent, and Vatican I. But that is not the Church's teaching. That heresy is refuted by Catholic teaching and the following considerations in particular. In his encyclical Satis Cognitum, which is one of the most important documents in Church history on these matters, Pope Leo XIII articulates what the Catholic Church has always taught on Church unity and recognizing heretics. This encyclical alone refutes many heresies in our day. It also proves that the teaching of Vatican II is heretical in numerous ways. Any honest person who reads Satis Cognitum and is familiar with Vatican II's teaching on the Church and non-Catholic sects will see that Vatican II was a heretical false council. Pope Leo XIII teaches that whoever departs in even the least way from the doctrine proposed by the authentic magisterium is to be considered outside Catholic communion and banished from the Church. Notice the phrase, in even the least way. To be considered Catholic, you can't simply claim to be Catholic and that the Church is your rule of faith. There are countless heretics who have made that claim. No, if you depart from the Church's authoritative teaching in even the least way, in even just one point, you are considered a heretic who is outside the Church. So keep in mind that it's a matter of the specific, not simply the general. A false profession on a specific dogmatic issue means that one is to be considered outside the Church. It's not necessary for the offender to reject the Catholic Church or the Catholic name in general. This principle was of course very important during the period of the Arian heresy, when false positions and false professions, even involving a single letter or a single word, were sufficient for Catholics to regard the adherents of various forms of Arianism as heretics who are outside of Catholic communion. And we will see that this principle is absolutely required and inextricably connected to the Church's unity and essential characteristics. For if people were considered members of the Catholic Church as long as they claim to be Catholic or recite Catholic creeds, even if they teach and profess notorious heresy and directly contradict the Church on this or that issue, then the Church would become a collection of false believers and notorious heretics who promote a corrupted and false faith, which is exactly what we see in the Vatican II counterchurch. Further, notice that Pope Leo XIII also teaches that if a person rejects any one of those truths, he thereby sends himself headlong into open heresy and separates himself from the Church. Again, we see that a person cannot be considered Catholic if he departs from the Church's teaching on any one of those points. A general rejection of the Church or the Catholic name is not required to be considered outside the Church. And of course, there were countless heretics in church history who claimed to be Catholic and recited Catholic creeds, just as there are today. Further, Pope Leo XIII teaches that if anyone holds to a single one of these heresies, he is not a Catholic. Notice again that if a person has a false position or a false profession on even just one specific issue that involves heresy, he cannot be considered Catholic. It doesn't require a general rejection of the Church or the Catholic name. As anyone can see, these facts about the Church's actual teaching refute the heresy promoted by various false traditionalists who claim that a man is a member of the Church and professes the true faith as long as he says that the Catholic Church is his rule, even if he professes notorious heresy and the opposite of the Catholic Church on a specific issue or issues. Their position is a heresy. According to their demonic heresy, to be considered a member of the Catholic Church, there's no obligation whatsoever to teach what the Catholic Church does in a specific way, and that is contrary to what the Church has always taught. In fact, notice that the other passage we quoted from Leo XIII is also directly on point. Leo XIII declares that you are not to be looked upon as holding the true Catholic faith if you do not teach that the faith of Rome is to be held. That is a specific teaching that someone like Francis, who condemns proselytism and declares illicit efforts to convince people of the faith of Rome, cannot be considered as professing the true Catholic faith. One could hardly ask for a more specific teaching that proves that Francis does not profess the true faith and therefore cannot be considered a true pope. One of the best illustrations that the aforementioned false traditionalist position is in fact evil, stupid, and heretical can be found by considering the members of the Vatican II sect. There are multitudes of notorious heretics of the worst kind in the Vatican II counterchurch and at Novus Ordo parishes. They claim to be Catholic and they say they accept the Church as their rule of faith, yet they support gay, quote, marriage or abortion or contraception or deny papal infallibility or promote some other horrible heresy.
And I just wonder, I hear what you're saying, but did you wrestle inside yourself?
Of course I wrestled with this, absolutely. As a Catholic, you say, I believe in this religion. There are amazing things about this religion, amazing moral teachings that I believe. But I also have to go to, how do we keep women alive? I believe in not letting women die. To me, that's more important than arguing about what method of contraceptive. So yes, I wrestled with it. And I finally realized I just had to do it. And even though I'm Catholic, I believe in contraceptives.
Many of the people that are opposed to gay marriage cite their religion as the reason why they're opposed. But you're a Catholic that supports gay marriage. Do you believe that religion and the idea that you can support gay marriage should be separated? And how do you grapple with the idea that you support gay marriage as a Catholic?
My religion has compels me, and I love it for it, to be against discrimination of any kind in our country.
My religion defines who I am, and I've been a practicing Catholic my whole life, and it has particularly informed my social doctrine. With regard to abortion, I accept my church's position on abortion as what we call de fide doctrine. Life begins at conception. That's the church's judgment. I accept it in my personal life. But I refuse to impose it on equally devout Christians and Muslims and Jews. And I just refuse to impose that on others, unlike my friend here, the congressman. I do not believe that we have a right to tell other people that women, they can't control their body. It's a decision between them and their doctor. Who do you love? Who do you love? And will you be loyal to the person you love? And that's what people are finding out, is what all marriages at their root are about. Whether they're marriages of lesbians or gay men or heterosexuals.
Is that what you believe now?
That's what I believe.
Two White House staffers have a wedding day they will never forget. Brian Mosteller and Joe Massey tied the knot on August 1st in a small ceremony surrounded by family and friends. And while most of the spotlight was on the happy couple, the man officiating the wedding probably received some attention as well. Current U.S. Vice President Joe Biden presided over Mosteller and Massey's wedding, which was held at the vice president's home in Washington, D.C. A first for the VP. Vice President Biden posted about the ceremony on Twitter saying, quote, "Couldn't be happier. Two longtime White House staffers, two great guys."
How would you describe your abortion position?
You know, I would say people use labels all the time, but I'm kind of a traditional Catholic. I don't like, personally, I'm opposed to abortion, and personally, I'm opposed to the death penalty.
Are there regulations that should be on abortion?
But let me continue. I deeply believe, and not just as a matter of politics, but even as a matter of morality, that matters about reproduction and intimacy and relationships and contraception are in the personal realm. They're moral decisions for individuals to make for themselves. And the last thing we need is government intruding into those personal decisions. So I've taken the position, which is quite common among Catholics. I got a personal feeling about abortion, but the right rule for government is to let women make their own decisions. So for example, Monday, the Supreme Court's likely to decide a really important case about abortion rights, which is many states, including Virginia, have tried to basically take out the constitutional right that gives women the ability to choose by putting these onerous regulations on clinics, health clinics where abortions are provided. We fought those off in Virginia when I was governor, because you've got to let people make their own moral choices when it comes to matters of reproduction, intimacy, and relationships.
We know and celebrate that marriage equality, after such a lengthy struggle, is now a law of this land. Every zip code, every state, every city, every county, every community. It's the law of the land. And we're not going backwards. Housing, hate crimes. My first executive action as governor of Virginia was to prohibit employment discrimination in state government on the basis of sexual orientation. Executive order number 1. Today, I do have the honor of joining Hillary Clinton on what the Human Rights Campaign has called the most pro-equality ticket in history. And that's great, and I hope the next ticket is even more pro-equality, and we need to keep doing that ticket after ticket, getting better and better. I've known Hillary a long time. Chad mentioned it. We all remember her speech in Geneva when she declared, quote, "Gay rights are human rights, and human rights are gay rights." And she was right about that. To ensure that all of the non-discrimination provisions in law, not one or the other, but every last one of them, applies to prohibit discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and protects LGBTQ. Now, my full, complete, unconditional support for marriage equality. I was proud to join my Senate colleagues in an amicus brief in the Supreme Court supporting full marriage equality. And how happy I was on the day the court declared yet again that equal is equal, just as love is love. How happy I was. Pope Francis famously said, "Who am I to judge?" And to that I want to add, who am I to challenge God for the beautiful diversity of the human family? I think we're supposed to celebrate it, not challenge it.
So, are they to be considered Catholic or not? According to actual Catholic teaching, the answer is a clear no. Since they take a position that is clearly contrary to the Catholic Church on a specific dogmatic issue or issues, they are considered outside the Catholic Church, even if they say they're Catholic, because professing the true faith is not just a matter of claiming to be Catholic. You must be consistent with the Church's dogmatic rule on specific matters. But according to everyone who accepts Antipapa Francis, all of the notorious heretics in the Vatican II, quote, Church must be considered Catholic, every single one of them, because basically none of them have been declared heretics by the Vatican II sect. This point is one of the most powerful illustrations of the falsity of the non-sedevacantist position. An exploration of this point demolishes the position of any defender of the Vatican II sect in a debate or an argument. As soon as you ask the person whether Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, Tim Kaine, or some other notorious apostate who claims to be Catholic is in fact Catholic, one will see why their position is totally idiotic and a mockery of Catholic teaching.
And that's what people are finding out, is what all marriages at their root are about. Whether they're marriages of lesbians or gay men or heterosexuals.
Is that what you believe now?
That's what I believe.
Now, my full, complete, unconditional support for marriage equality.
By professing that a notorious heretic like Tim Kaine is Catholic and part of the Church, as their position requires, they are, by definition, saying that he professes the true faith. That equates his support for abortion, gay quote marriage, etc. with the true faith. It equates a false religion with the true faith. That's why it's so evil to accept Francis. Typically, the defenders of the Vatican II sect ignore these points and the question of whether they consider the supporters of abortion, etc., to be Catholic. They like to ignore this issue because they realize that by addressing it, their position is exposed as idiotic. If they are forced to discuss it, they frequently lie and contradict themselves, typical of heretics. For instance, consider the following revealing clips in which certain false traditionalist heretics completely contradict the core principles on which their acceptance of Antipope Francis and the Vatican II antipopes is based. Remember, their recognition of the heretic Francis and the other Vatican II antipopes is inextricably connected to their false position that someone who claims to be Catholic and hasn't been declared a heretic cannot be considered a heretic who is outside the Church, even if he embraces notorious heresies. Notice that these dishonest heretics completely abandon their false position on that matter in the following clips and on selective occasions.
And they were celebrating it, and they were celebrating it together. Casper and the Pope. Casper, the radical theologian, the manifest heretic, really. He denies the apostolic succession. He not only denies the apostolic succession as a historical fact, he questions many of the miracles of Christ. It says that the gospel accounts of these may be legends. And this manifest modernist, this heretic, which is what he is, has been celebrated by Francis from the moment he came out on the balcony during his first Angelus address.
And he's teaching this. This is a teaching textbook. I know people who had this in university, said that it practically destroyed their faith. This is the effect that this is Casper's legacy, casting doubt on the historical reality of the Gospels. Now, a man who holds these heterodox views is not fit to be an altar boy, let alone a priest, let alone a bishop, let alone a cardinal of the Catholic Church giving advice to the Pope. In fact, every priest I know, and I'm not every priest I know, if a 7-year-old boy named Walter Casper came up to the priest to be examined for First Communion, and if this 7-year-old spouted the nonsense that I've just been quoting from the German cardinal, every priest I know would refuse him his First Communion. The priest would say, Walty, you're a liberal Protestant. You're not even Catholic. And most disturbing, and I think you know this because it's common knowledge really, Cardinal Walter Casper is one of Pope Francis's favorite theologians, a man to whom Francis looks for doctrinal wisdom and guidance.
And so you get these clowns like Supich now equating unemployment with the vivisection of human beings in the womb. This man is a joke. I won't even call, I don't even like to call him an archbishop. He isn't entitled to the dignity of that title. He's a laughing stock, and the hierarchy, unfortunately, is filled with such laughing stocks. I'm thinking, of course, of the always laughing Cardinal Dolan of New York.
Many of them, Chris, I don't believe they're Catholic. Like you say, I don't even know what Supich is. He doesn't seem to be a Catholic to me. He's an Arian. And the idea is to follow what St. Athanasius does back in the 4th century. He recognizes that they're heretics.
So someone has to be able to identify public sin. And so you can take issue in order to have those prohibitions against receiving the sacraments. So you can't just say, well, let's just pray and offer sacrifice for Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden. No, you got to say these people are apostate Catholics. In the old days, if you were an Arian, you ceased to be Catholic. In the old days, a Nancy Pelosi, I hate to beat up on old Nancy, but she's not a Catholic. She's not a liberal Catholic. She's no longer a Catholic. She's an apostate.
As we can see, when it's convenient or expedient for them, or when they are discussing particular individuals, the false traditionalists suddenly discover the Catholic Church's actual teaching and what all Catholics have always understood. That is, that people who clearly depart from the Church's rule of faith on even one point are to be considered heretics who are outside the Church, even if those people claim to be Catholic and haven't been declared heretics. Although they employ this principle on certain occasions, such as when they desire to denounce certain heretics like Pelosi, Biden, Supich, and Casper, they simultaneously promote and endorse a position that completely contradicts what they say in these clips. They have publicly endorsed the position of men who claim that Francis is a member of the Church, and that the offense of heresy in the external forum cannot possibly be committed except through formally joining a non-Catholic sect, ceasing to claim to be Catholic, or being declared guilty of heresy. A totally idiotic and heretical idea directly opposed to Catholic teaching, as we've seen.
Again, it's only when the sin is adjudicated by the church in the external form as criminal. And that's when both the material element of heresy and the formal element of heresy, which is the subjective will, the pertinacity, only when that is established by the church in the ecclesiastical form is then the man severed from the body of the church.
The publications for which they write teach the same false doctrine, namely that no one who claims to be Catholic can become an actual heretic in the external form unless he's declared guilty of heresy. That principle, they tell people, is why Francis is not to be considered an actual heretic, but rather a Catholic who professes the true faith. Yet, as we just saw, these false traditionalists totally abandon that principle when they discuss certain individuals in the Vatican II sect.
Casper and the Pope. Casper, the radical theologian, the manifest heretic, really, denies the apostolic succession, and this manifest modernist, this heretic, which is what he is.
And so you get these clowns like Supich now equating unemployment with the vivisection of human beings in the womb. This man is a joke. I won't even call, I don't even like to call him an archbishop. He isn't entitled to the dignity of that title.
Many of them, Chris, I don't believe they're Catholic. Like you say, I don't even know what Supich is. He doesn't seem to be a Catholic to me. He's an Arian. And the idea is to follow what St. Athanasius does back in the 4th century. He recognizes that they're heretics.
The priest would say, Walty, you're a liberal Protestant. You're not even Catholic.
In the old days, a Nancy Pelosi, I hate to beat up on old Nancy, but she's not a Catholic. She's not a liberal Catholic. She's no longer a Catholic. She's an apostate.
Their inconsistency is spectacular. All heretics are liars, and all false positions are characterized by lies and contradictions. That's what we see here. There is no possible way that someone can consistently invoke Catholic teaching on recognizing heretics to denounce Nancy Pelosi or Blaise Supich or Walter Casper as heretics, which of course they are, without also saying that Antipope Francis is a heretic, for Antipope Francis has taught notorious heresy hundreds of times. He constantly professes notorious heresy. That's why if I debated any of these people, I would demolish their position within a few minutes by, among other things, just asking them about this issue. Within just a few minutes, anyone of goodwill would see that their position is completely idiotic, totally contradictory, and heretical. If they respond to my question on this matter by admitting that Pelosi, Supich, Kane, Casper, etc. are real, actual heretics, then they are admitting that they are to be considered guilty of heresy in the external forum, and that they are therefore outside the Catholic Church, since the offense of heresy by its very own nature expels one from the Church. Okay, by what authority have you determined that people who claim to be Catholic and haven't been declared heretics are to be considered actual heretics who are outside the Catholic Church? Their answer to that question will of course prove that Francis must also be considered a heretic who is outside the Catholic Church by the very same principle and teaching. For the Catholic Church's teaching that those who depart from Catholic truth must be considered heretics and outside the Church doesn't just apply to some people. No, it applies to each and every person who clearly departs from the Church's teaching in even the least way, as we saw. So, admitting that Pelosi, etc. are to be considered actual heretics requires one to say that Francis is also to be considered an actual heretic who is outside the Church. But if they choose instead to say that Pelosi, etc. are not to be considered actual heretics, then they are saying that Pelosi, etc., despite their public utterances and professions of notorious heresy, are to be considered Catholics who profess the true faith. That conflates the promotion of Antichrist abominations and a false religion, such as belief in gay, quote, marriage, with the profession of the true faith. It proves that their position is demonic apostasy.
And even though I'm Catholic, I believe in contraceptives.
You're a Catholic that supports gay marriage.
I've been a practicing Catholic my whole life.
Well, whether they're marriages of lesbians or gay men or heterosexuals.
Is that what you believe now?
That's what I believe.
But I'm kind of a traditional Catholic, so I've taken the position, which is quite common among Catholics.
She declared, quote, gay rights are human rights and human rights are gay rights. And she was right about that. Pope Francis famously said, who am I to judge? And to that I want to add, who am I to challenge God for the beautiful diversity of the human family? I think we're supposed to celebrate it. Now, my full, complete, unconditional support for marriage equality.
No matter how they choose to answer, their position will be proven false because their position is false. The true position, which is totally consistent, is that yes, based on their public positions, Pelosi, etc., are to be considered actual heretics who are outside the Church, and so is the apostate Antipope Francis. Also, don't be deceived by certain liars who further attempt to confuse this issue. They sometimes state that even if Francis is an actual real heretic, he could still be the Pope, or it's not certain that he would not be the Pope. That's a total lie. It is certain that someone who is an actual heretic cannot be the Pope, since the offense of heresy, as we saw, by its very own nature separates one from the Church. That's also why Pope Paul IV declared in his bull Cum ex Apostolatus in 1559 that a heretic could not be validly elected Pope, and that even if he had been elected by all the cardinals and accepted by all, his election would be invalid and the faithful could reject him as an invalid heathen, etc., by the very fact that he was a heretic without any further declaration. It's also why the saints and doctors of the Church teach that a manifest heretic could not be a valid pope, and that a manifest heretic is excluded from the Church and any office in the Church ipso facto, without any declaration. The very recognition of him as a clear heretic is sufficient to reject him as outside the Church and as one who cannot hold office in the Church. Pope Paul IV even said that he issued his bull to combat the arrival of the abomination of desolation in the holy place, an indication that the end times prophecies would be connected to anti-popes in the temple of God, which is exactly what we've seen in the Vatican II apostasy. An actual heretic is by definition outside the Church, and someone who is outside the Church of course cannot be the head of the Church or the Pope. That is settled Church teaching. As Pope Leo XIII affirmed, it is absurd to imagine that he who is outside can command in the Church. Therefore, once a person admits that Francis is an actual heretic or that he does not profess the true faith, the debate is over. That person is admitting that he cannot be considered the Pope. Therefore, everyone who obstinately accepts Francis as the Pope, the SSPX, the Fraternity of St. Peter, etc., everybody, holds that he is not a heretic and that he professes the true faith. So, the aforementioned heretics and many people like them teach others the heretical nonsense and poison that no one who claims to be Catholic is a heretic unless he or she is declared to be one, yet they quickly abandon that patently absurd false doctrine for the idiocy and heresy it is, in many contexts where it proves itself to be stupid, unworkable, unreasonable, and anti-Catholic, such as when they discuss the notorious apostates Pelosi, Supich, Casper, etc. They are an abomination. Their failure to remain even slightly consistent with the positions and principles they spread around the world and confidently tell others to accept proves that they are false teachers who could not care less about the truth or consistency. They frequently contradict what they endorse and teach to others because fidelity to Catholic principles is not their priority. No, what matters to them is maintaining their false position and their false traditionalist enterprises. They have no faith and they are false teachers of the devil. What's amazing is that many people consider false traditionalists such as the ones we've exposed to be reputable, sharp, insightful, or reliable commentators and guides, when the truth is, as we've shown, they are heretical fools whose positions are totally inconsistent and contrary to Catholic principles. They couldn't care less about the Church's teaching, and they aren't even aware of what they publish. And within a few minutes of questioning, their position would be exposed as demonic nonsense and stupidity. They are tools Satan uses to keep people in false positions and in the counter-church. Yet, despite the fact that their positions have been totally exposed and refuted, many still look to them as traditional Catholic leaders and guides. The number of fools is infinite. So, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot say, without totally contradicting yourself and Catholic teaching, that Pelosi, Biden, Supich, Casper, Kane, etc. are non-Catholic heretics. But Francis is a Catholic Pope and a member of the Catholic Church. That's because Francis constantly teaches the notorious heresies that there are non-Catholic martyrs, that all the baptized are in the Church of Christ, and that it's not necessary to join the Catholic Church for unity and salvation.
Voy a convencer a otro que sea católico? No.
Those are his positions, and they constitute a false faith of notorious heresies. And that's just to name 3 of his notorious heresies which deny well-known solemnly defined dogmas. There are numerous others. There is no way around it. If you accept him as the Pope, you therefore hold that a man can adopt or promote any heresy or position whatsoever, and remain Catholic and be considered to profess the true faith. So, people who accept Francis as the Pope need to begin to be honest about what they believe. They need to face up to the reality of what their position entails. If you accept Francis as the Pope, you are saying that a man can literally believe and promote anything whatsoever, and be considered a member of the Catholic Church. According to you, a man could deny the deity of Christ publicly for decades. He could start clubs promoting gay, quote, marriage. He could travel the country giving speeches against the truth of the Immaculate Conception, etc., and he still professes the true faith according to you. That is your position. That is the position of the Society of St. Pius X, the Fraternity of St. Peter, etc. There is no way around it because Francis has taught notorious heresies which directly deny solemnly defined dogmas to the entire world on many issues for years. If he can promote that, without ceasing to be Catholic and without ceasing to profess the true faith, then a man can promote anything whatsoever without ceasing to profess the true faith according to you. Do you now see why obstinately accepting Francis as the Pope, in the face of these facts, is in fact apostasy? It is to equate a demonic false religion of notorious heresies with Catholicism. And so all of those fools who tell you, in the face of these facts and Francis's notorious heresies, that you can't judge whether he's the Pope, or you can't say that he's anathema and outside the church, or you can't say that he's a non-Christian, don't have the first clue what they are talking about. They are faithless heretics and tools of Satan who lead people to hell. They understand nothing about Catholicism. They know nothing about God. They have no faith whatsoever, and they haven't even imbibed the rudiments of Christianity. They can't distinguish a false religion from the true faith, or a notorious heretic who preaches a false gospel to the entire world from a man who professes the true faith. Those who continue to promote, support, or follow such heretics will follow them to hell. It's also interesting to note that before the conclusion of the Vatican II sect's recent synod on the family, the heretics Chris Ferrara and Michael Matt discussed what would happen if those living in adultery or invalid second quote marriages were officially allowed to receive quote communion in the Vatican II quote church. Ferrara stated that if it were allowed, then the Catholic Church would become effectively and in practice the equivalent of the Anglican sect. He said this before the conclusion of the synod and before the publication of Amoris Laetitia.
Chris, I got a really sort of a nagging feeling on this. I think they've put too much time. They've spent over a year working on this, and we're dealing with some colossal egos. I'm not convinced that it's going to be more of the same sort of Vatican II, mishy-mashy, time bomb type approach to this, what they're going to come up with. I think it's very possible they're going to change this teaching. I don't know what we're going to do, but there are a lot of people who are very worried. Catholics who are seeing this as potentially a real watershed in the most devastating sense, watershed moment in the history of the church. What do you think?
Well, obviously it is. We're looking at a potential historical turning point. In October, the battleground is already being put up again in the Synod Hall. There's going to be a struggle over the fundamental moral teaching of the church, which is protected by the discipline of the church, the 2,000-year-old discipline of the church. If that were to change, effectively, in practice, even if the official teaching is still on paper, the Catholic Church would become the Anglican Church.
Well, we know what happened. After the synod, Antipope Francis published Amoris Laetitia, which officially taught to the entire Vatican II sect that those living in adultery can be in the state of grace, a blatant heresy, and that those living in invalid second quote marriages may be admitted to the sacraments including quote communion, another blatant heresy. Those false teachings also show that Francis teaches a false gospel. Following Amoris Laetitia, Francis even affirmed that there is no other interpretation of his document than that it allows those living in invalid second quote marriages to receive quote communion. So, what they said would make their Vatican II quote church the equivalent of the Anglican sect has happened, and yet they still profess communion with it. That proves again that they are heretics and non-Catholics, the defenders and promoters of a non-Catholic sect. In the same meeting in which Francis condemned the Great Commission, he was asked what he likes about the Lutheran sect. He responded by saying, quote, "I really like the good Lutherans, the Lutherans who truly follow the faith of Jesus Christ."
Cosa piace a me della Chiesa luterana e cosa invece non gli piace? A me piacciono tanto I luterani buoni, È il meglio che I luterani che seguono davvero la fede di Gesù Cristo.
A man who professes that Lutherans truly follow the faith of Jesus Christ does not profess the true faith. Such a man is rather a notorious heretic who must not be considered a member of the Catholic Church. To say that he does profess the true faith, as defenders of his anti-papacy must assert, is to say that considering Lutheranism to be true is consistent with a profession of the true faith, which is a denial of the Catholic faith. In the same talk, Francis uttered the notorious heresy that all the baptized are members of the body of Christ. As stated earlier, he teaches this notorious heresy all the time. It denies numerous defined dogmas and dozens of magisterial pronouncements, which declare that all heretics and schismatics, anyone who dissents from the papacy or any Catholic dogma, is outside the body of Christ. Francis's profession of this notorious heresy alone would prove that he's not the Pope.
In virtù del nostro battesimo, tutti formiamo l'unico corpo di Cristo. Le diverse membra, infatti, formano un solo corpo.
By considering such a heretic to be the Pope, a person not only denies the Catholic truths we've discussed on church membership, professing the faith, etc., but he leads others to a wolf who will teach them heresy and lead them to hell. In an interview Francis recently gave to a, quote, Jesuit publication in the Vatican II sect, he spoke of the true religions in the plural, as if there is more than one true religion. He stated, quote, the true religions are the development of the capacity that humanity has to transcend itself towards the absolute, end quote. A man who professes that there is more than one true religion does not profess the true faith, but a false faith. To say otherwise is to apostatize. In a speech on October 1, 2016, Francis spoke about the schismatic so-called Orthodox, who reject the papacy and other dogmas, and he denounced trying to convert the, quote, Orthodox in the strongest terms. He even called trying to convert them a grave sin. Incredible. Notice how serious Francis is when denouncing efforts to spread the Catholic faith as a grave sin.
C'è un grosso peccato contro l'ecumenismo.
და არის ძალიან დიდი ცოდვა ეკუმენიზმის წინააღმდეგ.
Il proselitismo.
ამას ქვია პროზელიტიზმი.
Mai si deve fare proselitismo con gli ortodossi.
This is more notorious heresy from the apostate and another expression of his promotion of a false gospel. Francis does not profess the true faith but a false faith. To say otherwise is to apostatize. During his flight from Armenia to Rome on Sunday, June 26, 2016, Antipope Francis gave a press conference to the journalists aboard the plane. He was questioned about Martin Luther. He responded by saying that Lutherans and Catholics supposedly agree on justification, another blatant heresy, and that on the matter of justification, Luther was not mistaken. Amazing.
Io credo che le intenzioni di Martin Lutero non erano sbagliate. E oggi luterani e cattolici, protestanti tutti, siamo d'accordo sulla dottrina della giustificazione. Su questo punto tanto importante lui non aveva sbagliato.
A man who says that he agrees with Lutherans on justification and that Luther was not mistaken on justification is a notorious heretic and the member of a sect. He does not profess the true faith but a false faith. To say otherwise is to apostatize. If you are still in it, get out of the Vatican II sect, which is not the Catholic Church but the prophesied end times counterchurch. To be saved, it's necessary to be a Catholic, and that means that one must be a traditional Catholic. This situation was predicted as our material covers. As we've shown, Francis teaches that it's illicit and venomous to convince people of Catholicism. Anyone who, in the face of these facts, still considers him to be a Catholic and a member of the Catholic Church, and therefore that he professes the true faith, is an apostate. If you think that he's in the Catholic Church, in the face of these facts, you have apostatized from Jesus Christ, and barring a conversion, you will burn forever in the fires of hell. And those who obstinately promote or support the heretics who defend him as a valid pope will lose their souls.
Non è lecito convincere della tua fede. Il proselitismo è il veleno più forte contro il cammino ecumenico.
I've been a practicing Catholic my whole life.
Well, whether they're marriages of lesbians or gay men or heterosexuals.
Is that what you believe now?
That's what I believe.
I luterani che seguono davvero la fede di Gesù Cristo.
You're a Catholic that supports gay marriage.
E oggi luterani e cattolici, protestanti tutti, siamo d'accordo sulla dottrina della giustificazione. Su questo punto tanto importante lui non aveva sbagliato.
But I'm kind of a traditional Catholic, so I've taken the position, which is quite common among Catholics.
Gay rights are human rights, and human rights are gay rights, and she was right about that.
And this manifest modernist, this heretic, which is what he is.
He's an Arian.
You're not even Catholic.
Follow what St. Athanasius does back in the 4th century. He recognizes that they're heretics.
Voy a convencer a otro che sia cattolico? No, no, no. C'è un grosso peccato contro l'ecumenismo, il proselitismo. Mai si deve fare proselitismo con gli ortodossi.